The Strait of Hormuz dimension of Iran's economic collapse adds another layer of global financial risk entirely. Approximately 20% of global oil supply transits the Strait of Hormuz daily, according to U.S. Energy Information Administration data. That represents approximately 21 million barrels per day of oil and liquefied natural gas passing through a 33-kilometer wide choke point. And that choke point is not just a waterway. It is a pressure valve for the global economy. Iran has historically threatened Hormuz's closure as its ultimate economic deterrent, a threat that carries genuine and measurable market consequences. Even a partial Hormuz disruption would immediately push global oil prices toward $150 to $200 per barrel, according to energy market stress scenario analyses. At $150 oil, American gasoline prices would surge towards $6 to $7 per gallon, creating immediate and severe consumer spending pressure. That is where this crisis stops being distant. That is where it enters every household. A gasoline price spike of that magnitude would extract hundreds of billions of dollars from American consumer spending within weeks of occurring. Consumer spending represents approximately 70% of American GDP, making any severe energy price shock an immediate threat to overall economic growth. The Federal Reserve would then face a simultaneous inflation spike and growth slowdown. That is the stagflation scenario. And it has no clean monetary policy resolution at all. This Hormuz risk premium is already partially embedded in global oil futures pricing. But a full closure scenario remains significantly underpriced by most market participants. Now, look at the regional economic contagion from Iran's collapse, because the effects extend far beyond Iran's own 88 million population. Iraq, which shares a 1,158-kilometer border with Iran and has deep economic integration, faces significant spillover from Iranian economic deterioration. Iraqi-Iranian trade was valued at approximately $10 billion annually before the current crisis, according to Iraqi Trade Ministry data. Supply chain disruptions, cross-border employment, and energy interconnections mean Iranian economic collapse creates measurable economic stress in Iraq at the same time. Lebanon, already experiencing its own catastrophic economic collapse since 2019, faces additional pressure from regional instability driven by the Iranian crisis. Lebanon's banking system collapsed in 2019, destroying approximately $100 billion in depositor savings, according to World Bank assessments. Additional regional instability from Iran's economic and military crisis compounds Lebanon's already impossible reconstruction challenge. Syria, still recovering from over a decade of civil war that caused approximately $400 billion in economic damage, faces additional destabilization from Iranian crisis spillover. The combined economic stress across Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, and Syria creates a regional economic crisis zone affecting approximately 150 million people at the same time. That number is not abstract. It is a warning. Regional economic crises of this scale historically produce refugee flows that create political and economic stress in neighboring and destination countries simultaneously. European nations that absorbed significant Syrian refugee flows after 2015 are watching the Iranian crisis with concern about potential additional displacement pressure. Refugee flows generate political pressures that affect European domestic politics, immigration policy, and social cohesion in ways that have measurable economic consequences. The economic cost of managing refugee flows, housing, healthcare, education, and integration services adds fiscal pressure to European governments already carrying elevated debt levels. This refugee and migration dimension of Iran's economic collapse creates another channel through which Middle Eastern instability affects European and ultimately global economic stability. Now consider what Iran's economic collapse means for the global sanctions architecture that America has built and maintained over decades. Iran's experience under maximum pressure sanctions, followed by war damage and economic collapse, provides a real-time stress test of the American sanctions model. The sanctions regime was designed to create economic pressure sufficient to change Iranian government behavior on nuclear and regional policy issues. But the Iranian government has maintained its core policy positions, despite experiencing one of the most severe sanctions-induced economic contractions of any country in modern history. This outcome raises serious analytical questions about the effectiveness of sanctions as a tool for changing deeply entrenched government behavior in authoritarian systems. Countries observing Iran's sanctions experience, including Russia, China, North Korea, and Venezuela, are drawing lessons about sanctions resilience and dollar dependency reduction. Russia's experience with sanctions following its 2022 Ukraine invasion showed greater economic resilience than Western analysts initially projected, partly informed by studying Iran's adaptation. China has accelerated its own dollar dependency reduction, specifically to reduce vulnerability to the kind of sanctions pressure that devastated Iran's economy. The Iranian sanctions case is therefore contributing directly to the global de-dollarization trend that is weakening America's financial leverage over adversarial governments. Every country that watches Iran absorb maximum sanctions pressure and still resist policy change reduces its own assessment of sanctions as a credible deterrent. And when that credibility erodes, American geopolitical leverage erodes with it, not just in the Middle East. Everywhere Washington uses financial pressure. This erosion of sanctions credibility reduces American geopolitical leverage in ways that extend far beyond the Middle East into every region where Washington uses financial pressure. Gold's continued record price, above $3,100, reflects institutional awareness of these compounding geopolitical and financial risks, moving at the same time. Central banks buying gold at record pace specifically cite reduced confidence in the dollar-based financial architecture, an architecture that Iran's sanctions experience has visibly stressed. The ordinary American watching gasoline crisis, inflation, and geopolitical instability is directly connected to Iran's $270 billion economic catastrophe through these channels. Energy prices, refugee flows, sanctions, credibility erosion, dollar dominance challenges, regional instability, all of these connect Iranian economic collapse to American financial conditions. Understanding these connections transforms Iran's economic crisis from a distant foreign policy story into immediately relevant financial information about your cost of living. The investors, institutions, and policymakers who understand these geopolitical financial connections make better decisions than those who treat military and economic analysis as separate disciplines. Iran's economy is in freefall. The $270 billion in war damage has no reconstruction financing mechanism. The human cost is falling on 88 million people, and the financial reverberations of that collapse are already moving through oil markets, sanctions architecture, dollar dominance, and global inflation dynamics. The question now is not whether Iran's economic collapse matters. The question is how far its shockwaves will travel. Will Iran's economic collapse ultimately force policy change or deepen regional instability further over the next 5 years? That judgment may become one of the most important geopolitical economic judgments of this entire year. Now understand what $270 billion in war damage looks like when it lands on a collapsing economy. Iran's economy was in free fall before the first missile struck. Inflation above 40%, currency destroyed. The Iranian rial lost 90% of its value since 2018, according to Central Bank of Iran data. Foreign exchange reserves were effectively frozen by sanctions before a single additional dollar of war damage occurred. Now add $270 billion in estimated fiscal destruction to an economy with no fiscal buffer whatsoever. No access to international capital markets, no credible reconstruction financing mechanism available anywhere. The Iranian rial has collapsed to historic lows that would have seemed impossible just 7 years ago. Oil export revenues are being intercepted, monitored, and blocked through multiple sanctions enforcement mechanisms simultaneously. The economic damage is compounding at a pace that makes recovery without fundamental political change mathematically impossible. To understand the full scale of this economic catastrophe, you need baseline data about Iran's economy before the damage occurred. Iran's GDP stood at approximately $400 billion, according to IMF World Economic Outlook 2024 data. That makes Iran roughly the 40th largest economy globally, significant enough that its collapse creates measurable regional and global ripple effects. The Iranian economy was already severely stressed before any military escalation because of the compounding weight of international sanctions. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, reimposed in 2018, cut Iran's oil exports from approximately 2.5 million barrels per day to below 500,000 barrels. That reduction in oil export revenue, Iran's primary source of foreign exchange, removed approximately $50 billion annually from government finances. The cumulative impact of 5 years of suppressed oil revenues created fiscal deficits that Iran's government financed through money printing. Money printing on that scale, with limited foreign exchange reserves to defend the currency, produced the inflation crisis that came before the war damage. Iran's annual inflation rate exceeded 40% throughout 2023 and 2024, according to IMF Article 4 consultation data and independent economic monitoring. At 40% annual inflation, the purchasing power of Iranian savings halves approximately every 22 months, creating devastating wealth destruction for ordinary Iranians. The Iranian rial's collapse tells the full monetary story in the starkest possible numerical terms. In January 2018, before maximum pressure sanctions, the dollar-rial exchange rate stood at approximately 42,000 rials per dollar officially. By early 2025, the rial had deteriorated to approximately 600,000 rials per dollar in open market trading. That represents a 93% collapse in the rial's purchasing power against the dollar in approximately 7 years. A 93% currency collapse means that an Iranian family's savings worth $10,000 in 2018 dollar terms are now worth approximately $700 in real purchasing power. That wealth destruction is not abstract. It has eliminated the life savings of middle-class Iranian families who kept their wealth in rial-denominated assets. Now add the $270 billion in war damage to this already catastrophically weakened economic foundation, and the mathematics become genuinely staggering. $270 billion in physical infrastructure destruction on a $400 billion GDP economy represents approximately 67% of Iran's entire annual economic output, destroyed or severely disrupted. To understand what 67% GDP damage actually means, consider the historical comparisons. The most destructive conventional war damage ratios in modern history are sobering. World War II left Germany with approximately 20% to 25% of its physical capital stock destroyed, according to economic historians. And German recovery required the Marshall Plan. Iran has no Marshall Plan equivalent available, no international reconstruction financing framework, no access to IMF emergency lending or World Bank reconstruction programs. The sanctions regime that preceded the conflict, specifically designed to cut Iran off from international financial institutions, remains in place during the reconstruction period. This combination, massive physical destruction with zero access to international reconstruction financing, creates an economic recovery challenge without clear modern historical precedent. The specific categories of war damage compound the economic pain in ways that extend far beyond the immediate destruction period. Iran's oil infrastructure received significant damage in the conflict, according to satellite imagery analysis and industry assessments published by energy analysts. Iran's remaining oil export capacity, already suppressed to below 500,000 barrels per day by sanctions, faces additional reduction from physical infrastructure damage. Every 100,000 barrels per day of reduced export capacity represents approximately $3.6 billion in lost annual revenue at $100 per barrel oil pricing. Infrastructure damage to refineries, pipelines, and port facilities creates supply disruptions that extend the revenue loss beyond the immediate conflict period. Iran's manufacturing sector, concentrated in Isfahan, Tehran, and other urban centers, absorb damage that disrupts domestic production and employment at the same time. Manufacturing employment in Iran was already under severe stress from sanctions-induced import restrictions on machinery components and raw materials. War damage to manufacturing facilities adds physical destruction to the existing economic sanctions, stress, creating a combined shock to industrial employment. Iranian youth unemployment had already reached approximately 25%, according to official statistics center of Iran data, figures that independent analysts believe significantly understate reality. With manufacturing damage adding job losses to existing unemployment, the social stability implications of the economic collapse become increasingly severe and urgent. Now, look at how Iran's economic collapse creates spillover effects that reach directly into global oil markets and therefore into energy prices worldwide. Iran holds approximately 9% of the world's proven oil reserves, according to BP's statistical review of World Energy 2024 data. Even with exports suppressed by sanctions, Iran's potential production capacity of approximately 4 million barrels per day represents meaningful global supply capacity. More damage to Iran's oil infrastructure creates uncertainty about the timeline for any future return of Iranian oil to global markets. This uncertainty premium gets embedded in global oil futures pricing, adding a geopolitical risk component to energy costs worldwide. Higher oil prices from Middle East instability flow directly into American consumer energy costs. Gasoline, diesel, heating oil, prices that affect every household. The Federal Reserve's inflation management challenge becomes more complex when geopolitical oil price premiums add upward pressure to energy components of inflation indices. Energy price spikes driven by Middle East instability were a significant contributor to the inflation surge of 2021 and 2022 that the Fed struggled to contain. A sustained Iranian supply disruption combined with broader regional instability creates conditions for energy price pressures that complicate the Fed's path to its 2% inflation target. In other words, Iran's economic collapse is not trapped inside Iran's borders. It runs through oil terminals. It runs through shipping lanes. It runs through sanction systems, refugee routes, currency reserves, central bank decisions, and household budgets. What began as a national economic breakdown has become a global financial warning. And for anyone watching the next 5 years, the real issue is brutally simple. Iran's collapse may not just change Iran. It may test the price of energy, the strength of the dollar, the credibility of sanctions, and the resilience of every economy forced to absorb the shock.